The sky above Kael'thara burned like an open wound. Crimson clouds churned in violent spirals across the horizon, backlit by the dying light of 3 distant suns that had long since abandoned this sector of the galaxy to its wars. The air tasted of copper and ash, thick enough to coat the tongue, heavy enough to make every breath a conscious act of defiance against the battlefield's oppressive atmosphere. Smoke rose from 1,000 funeral pyres, some still burning the bodies of the fallen, others marking the graves of civilizations that had crumbled under the weight of endless conflict. This was the frontier. The edge of known space where empires clashed and bled, where species rose and fell with the changing of seasons, where legends were forged in the crucible of violence and survival. This was where the coalition of free worlds made its stand against the encroaching darkness of the Dominion, a sprawling empire of elder races who viewed humanity and its allies as little more than cattle to be culled or enslaved. And this was where Marcus Chen had learned what it meant to be human among gods. He stood now at the center of a killing field, his combat boots planted in soil that had drunk so much blood it had turned black beneath the rust-colored dust. His armor, once the pristine gray and blue of Coalition standard issue, hung in tatters across his frame. The composite plating over his left shoulder had been sheared away entirely, revealing the thermal weave underneath, torn and scorched. His right gauntlet sparked intermittently where the power cells had been damaged, and somewhere during the last engagement he'd lost his helmet entirely. The wind caught his dark hair, matted with sweat and grime, and pushed it back from his face. His jaw was set in a hard line, stubbled with days of growth, and his eyes, dark brown, remarkably human eyes, scanned the devastation with the practiced efficiency of a soldier who had seen too much death to be paralyzed by it anymore. Around him lay the evidence of the day's slaughter. Broken weapons jutted from the ground like grave markers. A Coalition plasma rifle, its barrel melted and fused. A Dominion shock lance snapped in half, its energy matrix still crackling weakly. Pieces of power armor, both human and alien, scattered like the shell casings of some cosmic gun. Bodies too, though Marcus tried not to look at those. Some had been his friends. Most had been his enemies. All of them were someone's something. The ruins of what had once been a forward operating base smoldered behind him. The prefabricated structures had been reduced to skeletal frameworks, their alloy bones twisted by weapons that operated on principles human science was still struggling to understand. Fires burned in pockets throughout the wreckage, casting dancing shadows that made the dead seem to move in the corner of his vision. But Marcus wasn't looking at the ruins or the bodies or even the hellish sky above. He was looking at her. She stood 30 meters away, positioned atop a slight rise in the terrain that gave her the high ground, not that she needed the tactical advantage. She would have dominated this space even if she'd been standing in a crater. The vampire Warbride. That's what the Coalition intelligence briefings called her kind, though Marcus suspected the term was a human approximation of something far more complex in her native tongue. Her species had a name, the Sanguiner, but it was the titles that mattered out here on the frontier. Titles were earned in blood. Titles meant something. And she had earned hers 1,000 times over. She towered over the battlefield at nearly 7 feet tall, though her frame carried the height with a predator's grace rather than awkward proportion. Her armor was a masterwork of alien metallurgy and dark artistry, black as the void between stars, trimmed with crimson that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The plating followed the contours of her powerful physique, broad shoulders that spoke of crushing strength, arms corded with lean muscle visible where the armor segmented to allow movement, a waist that tapered before flaring into hips built for both speed and devastating force. The armor itself was ornate in a way that human military doctrine would have called impractical, but the Sanguiner had learned long ago that psychological warfare was as valuable as kinetic force. Baroque designs were etched into every surface, spiraling patterns that resembled both circuitry and ancient runes, sharp edges and sweeping curves that made her silhouette unmistakable even at distance. Pauldrons rose from her shoulders like the wings of some predatory bird, and from her waist hung a tattered cloak that had once been deep red but was now nearly black with the accumulated grime of campaign. But it was her face that held Marcus captive. Well, not the pallor of sickness or death, but the alabaster perfection of carved marble given life. Her features were sharp and aristocratic, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that were full and dark as wine. Her hair, long and white as fresh snow, was pulled back in a warrior's braid that fell past her shoulders, Those strands had come loose during the fighting and now framed her face like pale fire. And her eyes. God, her eyes. They glowed with their own internal luminescence, burning red like coals in a dying fire, but with an intensity that suggested the fire was anything but extinguished. Those eyes had tracked him across the battlefield for 3 months now. Those eyes had watched him fight, watched him kill, watched him survive when by all rights he should have died a dozen times over. Those eyes saw something in him that Marcus himself wasn't sure existed. In her right hand, she held her signature weapon, a massive blade that human xenoanthropologists had classified as a Zweihander variant, though that description did the weapon a gross disservice. The sword was easily 6 feet long, its blade forged from some dark metal that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. The edges hummed with a faint crimson energy field that could slice through coalition battle plate like it was paper. The crossguard was worked into the shape of bat-like wings, and the pommel held a crystal that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, if she even had a heartbeat in the way humans understood the term. Right now, that blade was planted point first into the earth beside her, and her gauntlet hand rested on the pommel with casual ownership. The posture should have been relaxed, almost restful, but everything about her radiated coiled tension. A predator at rest, but ready to explode into violence at the slightest provocation. Dark mist coiled around her boots, wisps of crimson energy that rose from the cracks in the earth where her power had seeped into the ground. It was said that the sanguiner drew their strength from blood, not just the drinking of it, though that was certainly part of their mystique, but from the very concept of it. Life force made manifest, vitality weaponized. On worlds where great battles had been fought, where the soil was rich with the fallen, a sanguiner could become something close to unstoppable. And Kael'thas's soil was very, very rich. She had been standing there for 10 minutes now watching him. Just watching. The rest of both armies had pulled back, some to regroup, others because they recognized the signs of what was about to happen and had the wisdom to give it space. Even in the middle of a war that had consumed a dozen star systems, some moments demanded to be witnessed or avoided entirely. Marcus checked his gear with mechanical precision. His primary weapon was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos when a Dominion shock trooper had nearly taken his head off. His sidearm remained, a heavy combat pistol that used magnetically accelerated slugs, but he had maybe half a magazine left, and he knew from experience that small arms fire was largely useless against sanguiner battle armor unless you got very, very lucky. His combat knife was still maglocked to his thigh plate. 20 centimeters of monomolecular edged carbon composite. He'd used it to kill 3 Dominion soldiers today alone, getting in close where their superior technology couldn't track fast enough. It had earned him a reputation among both sides, the human who fought like he had nothing to lose. That reputation had reached her. Marcus felt his heart hammering in his chest, not from fear, though any sane person would be terrified right now. No, this was something else. Something that had been building for months, ever since the first time their eyes had met across a battlefield on Xerxes Prime. Something that had intensified with every encounter, every near miss, every moment where they'd been close enough to kill each other and hadn't. Desire. Raw, primal, undeniable desire. He wanted her in ways that defied logic or survival instinct. Wanted her with an intensity that kept him awake during what little downtime he got, that invaded his thoughts during firefights when his focus should have been entirely on staying alive. He tried to rationalize it, combat adrenaline, proximity to death heightening all sensations, the exotic allure of an enemy who was so clearly superior in so many ways. But rationalization was just lying to yourself with extra steps. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. He wanted her and she knew it. And now, standing here on this field of the dead, she had finally decided to do something about it. Her voice carried across the distance between them, rich and resonant, with an accent that lilted through Terran standard in ways that made the harsh military language sound almost musical. Human. Not a question. Not a greeting. A statement of fact, heavy with implications. Marcus swallowed hard and forced himself to speak, his voice rougher than he'd intended. I have a name. Her lips curved into something that might have been a smile on someone less dangerous. I know your name, Marcus Chin. I have known it since Xerxes Prime, when you held the Eastern Ridge for 6 hours against a force that should have overrun your position in 6 minutes. I know that you are from a world called Earth, from a nation-state that no longer exists, that you joined the coalition military to escape poverty and found purpose in war. I know that you have 17 confirmed kills against Dominion forces, and another 8 that your officers refuse to confirm because they do not believe a human could have survived the circumstances long enough to claim them. She paused, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly. I know that for 3 months, you have looked at me with hunger that exceeds even your will to live. I know that you dream of me. I know that you would trade years of your short life for a single night in my arms. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one stripping away a layer of the professional soldier's mask he'd been wearing. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He should deny it. Should laugh it off or play it cool or do any of 100 things that might give him tactical advantage in whatever game she was playing. Instead he told the truth. Yes. The single word hung in the air between them, naked and undefended. Her expression shifted. Surprise, perhaps, though it was difficult to read emotion on features so alien despite their superficial similarity to human. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with new intensity. You do not even attempt to dissemble. Do you not fear what I might do with such admission? Marcus laughed, a short, bitter sound. Fear? I'm standing on a battlefield where 90% of my unit died today, facing down a vampire Warbride who could rip me in half without breaking a sweat, and you're asking if I'm afraid of being honest about wanting you? Lady, fear stopped being relevant about 3 corpses ago. Something flickered in those burning red eyes. Amusement? Respect? It was gone too quickly to name. You are either very brave or very broken human. Perhaps both. She lifted her blade from the ground in one smooth motion, the massive weapon moving as though it weighed nothing in her grip. But desire is cheap. Desire is easy. Even the weakest creature can want. What matters is whether you are strong enough to survive what you desire. She began to walk down the slope toward him, her boots crunching on the debris-strewn ground. Each step was measured, deliberate, full of lethal grace. The mist at her feet thickened, following her like a living thing. Marcus's hand dropped instinctively to his combat knife, though he didn't draw it. Not yet. His pulse thundered in his ears. My kind do not mate with the weak, Marcus Chin. We do not waste our strength on those who would break beneath us. For 3 months I have watched you. I have seen you fight. I have seen you survive. I have seen the fire in your eyes even when you stand alone against impossible odds. She was 10 meters away now. Close enough that he could see the intricate patterns etched into her armor in detail, could smell something on the air that reminded him of ozone and cinnamon and blood. But watching is not knowing. And I must know before I can claim you. 5 meters. So here is what will happen, little human. You will fight me. Not to the death. You are too valuable to waste, and I confess I have grown fond of tracking you across battlefields. But you will fight me with everything you have. Every skill. Every desperate trick. Every ounce of that stubbornness that has kept you alive when so many others have fallen. 3 meters. Her eyes bored into his, and Marcus felt like he was being stripped down to his component atoms under that gaze. And if your body proves strong enough, if you can withstand even a fraction of what I am, then perhaps you will learn what it means to be desired by a daughter of Sanguine. Perhaps you will know pleasures that your kind have only dreamed of in their most fevered imaginings. 1 meter. She stopped directly in front of him, towering over his 6-foot frame, so close now that he could feel the heat radiating from her armor. Or maybe that was her. He'd heard that Sanguiner ran hot, that their metabolisms burned at rates that would kill a human. She lifted her free hand and placed one armored finger under his chin, tilting his face up to meet her gaze fully. But if you break... Her smile was sharp enough to cut. If you shatter like so many others who have tried to reach above their station, then you will have your answer, won't you? You will know that your desire was nothing but the foolish dream of prey imagining itself worthy of the predator's attention. Marcus should have been terrified. Every nerve ending should have been screaming at him to run, to fight, to do anything except stand here and accept what she was proposing. This was insane. This was suicide with extra steps. But God help him, he'd never wanted anything more in his entire life. He reached up slowly, deliberately, and wrapped his hand around her wrist. Her armor was warm under his palm, almost hot, and he could feel the immense strength in that arm. She could snap his neck without effort, could break every bone in his body before he could even process the pain. His voice was steady when he spoke. I'm still standing, aren't I? For a long moment, she simply stared at him, those red eyes searching his face for something, doubt, perhaps, or the first signs of the fear that any rational being should be experiencing. Then she threw back her head and laughed. It was a sound that rolled across the battlefield like thunder, rich and genuine and utterly without mockery. When she looked back down at him, there was something new in her expression. Something hungry and eager and dangerous in all the best ways. "Oh, you beautiful, stupid, magnificent creature," she said, and there was something almost affectionate in her tone. "Yes, you are still standing. So let us see how long that lasts." She released him and took 3 steps back, her blade coming up into a guard position. The crimson energy along its edges intensified, casting bloody light across her features. "Draw your weapon, Marcus Chin. Show me what humanity is capable of when it refuses to know its place." Marcus drew his combat knife. The disparity between them was almost comical. Her massive blade that could cleave a tank in half, his knife that would be considered inadequate for cutting vegetables by many standards. But he'd learned long ago that the weapon mattered far less than the will behind it. He dropped into a fighting stance, knees bent, weight on the balls of his feet, knife held in a reverse grip. His offhand came up guard style, ready to redirect or block. His breathing steadied, falling into the rhythm that his drill instructors had beaten into him during basic training a lifetime ago. Around them, the battlefield held its breath. And then she moved. She was fast. Marcus had known intellectually that the Sanguiner were faster than humans. The briefings had covered that in excruciating detail, with charts and graphs and grainy footage from survivors' helmet cams. But knowing something in abstract and experiencing it firsthand were 2 entirely different universes of understanding. One moment she was 3 meters away, blade raised. The next, she was on him, that massive sword cutting through the air in an arc that would have bisected him at the waist if he'd been a fraction of a second slower. He threw himself backward, his combat instincts overriding conscious thought. The blade passed through the space where his torso had been with a sound like tearing silk, the energy field leaving a burning afterimage on his retinas. He hit the ground in a roll, came up in a crouch, and immediately had to dive left as she pivoted and brought the sword down in an overhead strike that cratered the earth where he'd been. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground that Marcus felt in his bones. She didn't give him time to recover. The sword came up again, this time in a horizontal sweep at chest height. Marcus dropped flat, feeling the displacement of air as the blade passed inches above him, and lashed out with his leg in a sweep of his own, aiming for her ankle. It was like kicking a steel girder. Pain flared up his shin, but he'd accomplished his goal. She shifted her weight just slightly, and that gave him the opening he needed to scramble back and create distance. Not much distance. Maybe 2 meters. But on a battlefield, 2 meters could be the difference between life and death. She regarded him with those burning eyes, and he could swear she looked pleased. "Good," she said, her breathing not even elevated. "You fight like someone who understands death intimately. Not seeking it but not fleeing from it either. Dancing along the edge." Marcus didn't waste breath responding. He was already breathing hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. She hadn't even been trying yet. That had been her testing his reflexes, seeing how he moved. The real fight hadn't started. She proved him right a moment later. This time when she came at him, there was no testing, no measuring. She was a whirlwind of black armor and crimson energy, her blade moving in patterns that seemed impossible for something so large. High strike, low strike, thrust, sweep, each attack flowing into the next with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent centuries mastering the art of killing. Marcus moved on pure instinct and muscle memory. Dodge, parry with the reinforced edge of his gauntlet, duck, roll, create angles, never stay still, never give her a clean line. His combat knife was useless as an offensive weapon against her armor, so he didn't even try. Instead, he used it as a tool for deflection, catching the flat of her blade and redirecting just enough to slip past rather than through. It was the kind of fighting that couldn't be sustained. Every near miss cost him energy. Every deflection sent shocks up his arms that threatened to numb his fingers. Every dodge required burning through reserves of stamina that were already depleted from a day of combat. But he was holding his own. Barely. Against all logic and probability, he was surviving. She drove him back across the battlefield, her attacks relentless. He gave ground because the alternative was death, but he gave it grudgingly, making her work for every meter. Once he managed to get inside her guard and drove his knife toward the seal at her neck, not to kill but to prove he could. She caught his wrist with her offhand before the blade found its mark, and the grip was like being seized by a hydraulic press. For a frozen moment they were locked together. Her face was inches from his, those red eyes boring into him with an intensity that was somehow more intimate than any touch. Yes, she breathed, and there was hunger in that word that had nothing to do with blood. Yes, you see the openings. You fight not with strength but with cunning. This is good. Then she threw him. Marcus sailed through the air in a graceless arc and hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. He rolled with the impact, using momentum to come up on one knee, but his vision swam and his ribs screamed protest. Probably cracked at minimum. She was walking toward him again, not rushing now. Her blade rested on her shoulder, almost casual. Most would be unconscious from that, she observed. Some would be dead from the impact alone. But you rise. Still you rise. Tell me, Marcus Chin, what drives you? Pride. Lust. Stubbornness. Marcus spat blood, he'd bitten his tongue at some point, and grinned up at her. All three. Plus I'm too mean to quit. That laugh again, rolling across the killing field like summer thunder. Too mean to quit. I like this phrase. It is very human. She was 5 meters away now. 4. 3. Marcus's hand closed around something half buried in the rubble beside him. He didn't look down, didn't give away what he'd found, just tracked her approach and waited for the right moment. 2 meters. I think perhaps we are done with the testing phase, yes? I think now we... Marcus surged to his feet and threw the object he'd grabbed, a piece of twisted metal debris about the size of his fist, directly at her face. Not her armored torso or arms, but her face, the one part of her that was relatively unprotected. Her reflexes were superhuman, but even she hadn't expected him to weaponize the battlefield itself at point-blank range. She got her offhand up and batted the projectile aside, but it forced her head to turn, forced her attention to split for just a fraction of a second. Marcus had already closed the distance. He hit her low and hard, driving his shoulder into her midsection with every ounce of force he could muster. It was like tackling a brick wall wrapped in steel, but the impact was placed perfectly, right at her center of gravity, right as her weight was shifting from the defensive motion. She stumbled backward. It was only a step. Maybe 2. But she stumbled, and the surprise on her face was worth every broken rib and pulled muscle. Marcus didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. He stayed in close, inside the arc of her massive blade where it was too long to be effective, and drove a rapid series of strikes into the gaps in her armor. Elbow to the joint at her side. Knee toward her midsection. Knife reversed to use the pommel as a striking tool against the seals at her neck. None of it was going to seriously hurt her. He knew that. But it wasn't about damage, it was about proving a point. She caught him by the throat. One moment he was attacking, the next his feet were off the ground and his windpipe was being compressed by fingers that could crush steel. She held him at arm's length, and her expression was something between fury and exhilaration. You dare, she hissed, but there was no real anger in it. You dare to strike at me, to make me yield ground, to fight as though you are my equal. Marcus couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, but he managed to maintain eye contact. Managed to not claw at her grip or show panic. Managed to keep that defiant glare locked on her face even as black spots began to dance at the edges of his vision. Her eyes widened slightly. Still, she said, her voice dropping to something almost like wonder. Still you do not break. Your body fails but your will remains. This is... She lowered him back to the ground and released his throat. Marcus collapsed to his knees, gasping and coughing, his hand at his neck where he could already feel the bruises forming in the shape of her fingers. She knelt before him, and when she reached out this time, her touch was almost gentle. She cupped his face in one armored hand, tilting it up so he had to meet her gaze. I have killed thousands, she said softly. Hundreds of thousands across 3 centuries of war. I have fought champions of a dozen species, have broken the strongest warriors of the Dominion beneath my blade. But I have never. She paused, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked uncertain. I have never seen one so fragile refuse to acknowledge their fragility. You should be dead, Marcus Chin. A dozen times over in this fight alone, you should be dead. Yet you persist. Not because you are strong enough to stand against me, you are not. But because you refuse to accept that you cannot. She leaned in closer until her forehead was nearly touching his. This is what I have been searching for. Not strength of body, I have that in abundance. Not skill at arms, I have that as well. But this refusal. This stubborn, foolish, magnificent human will that looks at the impossible and simply does not care. Marcus found his voice, though it came out as a rasp. Does this mean I passed your test? Her laugh was quieter now, more intimate. Passed? No, little human. You have not passed. You have exceeded. You have shown me something I did not know I was looking for. She stood and with surprising gentleness hauled him to his feet. His legs barely supported him, but he managed to stay upright through sheer determination. Your body is breaking, she observed, running her gaze over him with what might have been professional assessment or something far more personal. 3 cracked ribs at minimum. Severe bruising across 60% of your body. Mild concussion. Strained muscles in both legs. Microfractures in your left radius from blocking my strikes. By all medical standards, you should be seeking immediate treatment. Probably, Marcus agreed. But I'm still standing. Yes, she said, and there was something fierce and possessive in her tone now. You are. So let me make you an offer, Marcus Chin. An offer that I have never made to any being in 3 centuries of life. She gestured around them at the battlefield, at the ruins and the dead and the burning sky. This war will continue. Tomorrow or the next day or the day after that the fighting will resume. We will be on opposite sides once more, and we will do our duties to our respective causes. But tonight. She stepped closer until there was no space between them, until he had to crane his neck back to maintain eye contact. Tonight, there is a neutral zone 17 kilometers north of here. Old terraforming station, abandoned for decades. Neither side claims it. Neither side patrols it. If you can make it there before the next sunrise. Her hand came to rest on his chest, over his heart. He could feel the heat of her even through his armor. I will be waiting. And I will show you what it means to be chosen by a daughter of Sanguine. I will show you pleasures and pains that your kind have no names for. I will test your body and your will in ways that make this fight seem like a pleasant dance. And if you survive the night, if you prove that you are strong enough to be mine, then perhaps we will have this conversation again. Marcus's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could feel it. And if I don't survive? Her smile was sharp and honest. Then you will die having achieved something none of your kind have ever managed. You will die knowing that for one night, you were the equal of a Warbride. There are worse fates, little human. The first kilometer was agony. Every step sent fresh lances of pain through Marcus's ribs, and his left leg had developed a concerning hitch where he must have pulled something during the fight. His combat HUD was offline, had been since that near miss with the Dominion shock trooper, so he couldn't monitor his vitals or access navigation data. He was navigating by dead reckoning and the position of the dying suns, the oldest methods humanity had ever known. The terrain didn't make it easier. Kilthara had been a garden world once before the war came. Now it was a scarred wasteland of bomb craters and collapsed buildings, of forests reduced to skeletal remains and rivers that ran black with contaminants. The ground shifted unpredictably between hard-packed earth and loose debris, forcing him to watch every step lest he turn an ankle or worse. He passed through the remains of what had been a civilian settlement, hablocks reduced to their foundations, a children's park with swings still hanging from twisted metal frames, a marketplace where wind chimes made from shell casings created haunting melodies in the breeze. The war had been here long before Marcus arrived, and it would be here long after he left. If he left. The second kilometer, his breathing had settled into a rhythm. The pain was still there, would be there for weeks probably, but he'd compartmentalized it the way soldiers learned to do. Pain was just information, and that information was telling him he was still alive. As long as he could feel pain he could keep moving. He encountered the first patrol during the 3rd kilometer. 3 Dominion soldiers, insectoid species whose name Marcus had never bothered to learn. They were performing a standard sweep pattern, their weapons held ready, their compound eyes scanning for threats. Under normal circumstances, Marcus would have tried to avoid contact. He was in no condition for another fight. But they were directly between him and his destination. He took them from ambush, using the rubble of a collapsed overpass as cover. The first one never knew he was there. Marcus's knife found the weak point at the base of its skull before it could raise an alarm. The second managed to turn to bring its weapon up, but Marcus was already inside its guard, using its own body as a shield against the third. 2 quick strikes to disable it, then a pivot and a throw that sent his knife spinning through the air to embed itself in the third soldier's thorax. It was over in 6 seconds. Marcus retrieved his knife, checked the bodies for anything useful, found a half-full canteen of water that tasted like industrial runoff but was probably safe for human consumption, and kept moving. Behind him, the bodies would be discovered eventually. Alarms would be raised. Patrols would be intensified. He'd be long gone by then. One way or another. The 4th and 5th kilometers blurred together into a haze of pain and determination. The suns had finally set completely, leaving only the ambient glow of distant fires and the occasional flare of weapons discharge on the horizon to light his way. The darkness was actually an advantage. It hid him from long-range sensors and aerial patrols, and he'd spend enough time on night ops that navigating by starlight was second nature. When the moons rose, Kael'thara had 3, all irregular chunks of captured rock. He took a brief rest in the shadow of a downed coalition dropship. The vessel had been gutted, its crew long since evacuated or dead, but the hull provided shelter from the wind that had picked up. Marcus allowed himself 10 minutes to rest his legs and drink from the captured canteen. He thought about her. About the way she'd moved, fluid and deadly. About the intelligence in those burning eyes, the sharp wit behind her words. About the challenge she'd issued and the promise implicit in it. His body ached and his mind was fuzzy with exhaustion, but the memory of her presence was sharp and clear, a beacon pulling him forward through the night. Was this insane? Absolutely. Was he going to die? Quite possibly. Did that matter? Not even a little bit. He'd spent his entire life being told what he couldn't do. Couldn't escape poverty without selling his body to the military. Couldn't survive basic training, he was too small, too weak, too undisciplined. Couldn't make it through real combat. The first firefight would break him like it broke so many others. Couldn't stand against the Dominion's superior forces, couldn't hold ground that should have been overrun, couldn't possibly have earned those kills that command refused to confirm. Couldn't possibly be worthy of the attention of a creature like her. Marcus stood up, his muscles protesting, and kept walking. He was very good at proving people wrong. The 7th kilometer brought him to what had once been a river. Now it was a toxic sludge barely 2 meters wide, but it still represented an obstacle. His armor wasn't rated for full immersion in unknown chemicals, and he didn't have the energy to search for a crossing point. So he waded through. The liquid was warm and thick, with a consistency that made his stomach turn. It soaked through the damaged sections of his armor and found every cut and abrasion on his skin, burning like acid. He bit down on a scream and pushed forward until he reached the far bank, where he spent 5 minutes using sand to scrub the worst of it off before continuing. 8th kilometer. Night. That. He was halfway there and the night was maybe half over. The math was in his favor, barely, but his body was reaching its limits. He'd been awake for nearly 30 hours, had fought in multiple engagements before his confrontation with her, and was now attempting a forced march that would challenge a soldier in peak condition. He wasn't in peak condition. He was held together by painkillers metabolizing out of his system, adrenaline fumes, and sheer bloody-mindedness. She released him and stepped back, her blade coming up in a salute that was almost respectful. 17 kilometers north. The old station. Before sunrise. Her eyes glowed brighter. Do not be late. Then she turned and walked away, her crimson cloak billowing behind her, the mist at her feet dissipating as she moved. Within moments she had disappeared into the ruins, leaving Marcus alone in the center of the battlefield. He stood there for a long moment, his body screaming protest at the abuse it had endured, his mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. 17 kilometers. Through terrain that was still technically a combat zone. In his condition. Before sunrise. It was impossible. It was suicide. It was exactly the kind of challenge that Marcus Chin had spent his entire military career learning to overcome. He checked the angle of the suns and did rough calculations. Maybe 6 hours until full dark, then another 8 until sunrise. 14 hours total. 17 kilometers in 14 hours, injured, through hostile territory. He'd done worse. He started walking north, each step a small victory against the pain and exhaustion that threatened to drag him down. Behind him, the battlefield of Kael'thara continued to smolder, and above him, the crimson sky slowly deepened toward night. And ahead of him, somewhere in the darkness, a vampire Warbride waited. Marcus Chin smiled through the pain and kept walking. During the 11th kilometer, he started hallucinating. Nothing major, just shadows that moved wrong, sounds that didn't quite make sense. His brain, deprived of sleep and running on fumes, was starting to fill in gaps in sensory data with increasingly creative fiction. He saw his drill instructor from basic screaming at him to move faster. Saw his parents' disappointed faces asking why he'd thrown his life away. Saw comrades who died on Xerxes' Prime, asking why he'd survived when they hadn't. He saw her walking beside him, her red eyes glowing in the darkness. Still walking, little human? The hallucination asked. Still pushing forward when your body begs for rest? This is what I wanted to see. This refusal to yield. Marcus ignored the hallucination and kept walking. The real her was waiting ahead. The real her was worth every step. The 12th kilometer almost killed him. He was crossing what had been an industrial sector when the ground beneath him simply gave way. Some subsurface cavity, weakened by bombardment, chose that exact moment to collapse. Marcus fell 3 meters into darkness, landing in a heap of his own broken body, and for several seconds he genuinely believed this was it. This was where his journey ended, not in glorious combat, not in her arms, but in a forgotten hole in the ground on a world nobody cared about. Then he remembered who he was. What he was. What he'd promised himself. He was Marcus Chin and he was too mean to quit. Getting out took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of climbing rubble with broken ribs, of pulling himself up with arms that shook with exhaustion, of refusing to acknowledge that the task was impossible. When he finally dragged himself over the edge and back onto solid ground, he lay there gasping for 10 full minutes before he could move again. 13 kilometers down. 4 to go. The sky was already beginning to lighten at the edges. Dawn was coming, indifferent to his struggle. Marcus pushed himself to his feet and walked faster. The 14th and 15th kilometers passed in a blur. He'd moved beyond pain into some transcendent state where his body was simply a machine that responded to will, where the meat and bone and blood were irrelevant compared to the determination that drove them forward. Every step was a prayer to gods he didn't believe in. Every breath was a victory stolen from the universe's indifference. The 16th kilometer brought him to the edge of the neutral zone. He could see the terraforming station ahead, a cluster of prefabricated structures on a small rise, their shapes dark against the gradually brightening sky. No lights. No signs of life. Abandoned just as she'd said. Marcus checked the horizon. The first sun would break in maybe 30 minutes. He'd made it. Against all probability, against all reason, he'd actually made it. He covered the last kilometer at something that couldn't quite be called running but was faster than walking. His entire body screamed protest, but he ignored it with the ease of long practice. The station grew larger with each step, resolving into details. A central hub, 3 smaller structures arrayed around it, solar panels long since shattered, antennae bent and broken. And standing in the entrance to the central hub, backlit by emergency lighting that still somehow functioned, was her. She'd removed her armor. Marcus's brain stuttered to a halt at the sight. He'd never seen a sanguiner without their battle plate, had assumed they never removed it. But she stood there in what appeared to be a form-fitting black bodysuit that showed the true lines of her physique, powerful shoulders, arms that were all lean muscle, a waist that tapered before flaring into hips that could crack stone, legs that went on forever. Her white hair was unbound now, falling past her shoulders in waves that caught the dim light. Without the armor, she was somehow more intimidating, not less. The armor had been her war face, the thing she wore to kill. This was her, naked in a way that had nothing to do with clothing. She watched him approach, her red eyes tracking every limping step, and her expression was unreadable. Marcus stopped 5 meters from the entrance, swaying slightly on his feet, and met her gaze. "Before sunrise," he said, his voice a rasp. "As requested." For a long moment she simply stared at him. Then she shook her head slowly, and when she spoke, there was something like awe in her voice. "You absolute fool. You beautiful, stubborn, impossible fool. You should not have been able to make this journey. Not in your condition. Not in this time frame. It should have been impossible." Marcus grinned through split lips. "I'm human. We specialize in the impossible. She laughed, that rich sound that he'd come to crave, and closed the distance between them in 3 swift strides. Before he could react, she'd swept him up in her arms, one arm under his knees, one supporting his back, and was carrying him toward the entrance as though he weighed nothing. "Come," she said, her voice gentle despite her strength. "You have proven yourself beyond any doubt. Now let me show you what you have earned." Marcus wanted to protest, to say he could walk on his own, but his body had finally reached its limit. The moment she picked him up, it was as though every system simultaneously recognized that the crisis was over and simply stopped. He slumped in her arms, and the last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was her face, looking down at him with an expression that might have been tenderness. And then, for a time, there was nothing. Marcus woke to sensation. Not pain, surprisingly. He'd expected to wake in agony if he woke at all. Instead, there was a deep, pervasive warmth that seemed to radiate from his core outward, and with it came a gradual awareness that his body was being attended to. He opened his eyes slowly, letting them adjust to the dim lighting. He was lying on something soft, a cot or bedroll, in what appeared to be one of the station's converted living quarters. Emergency lighting strips along the walls provided a gentle amber glow, and through a window he could see that the first sun had fully risen. He'd been unconscious for at least an hour, possibly more. And she was there. She knelt beside the cot, her white hair falling around her face as she worked with focused intensity on his injuries. Her hands, no longer armored, just pale skin over impossible strength, moved with surprising gentleness across his torso, where she'd stripped away the remains of his combat armor and the underlayer beneath. Some kind of salve or gel coated her fingers, and wherever she touched, that warmth intensified. Marcus tried to speak, managed only a croak. Her eyes flicked up to his face immediately, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Quiet little human. You are being healed. Do not undo my work with unnecessary movement." Right. He'd heard that Sanguiner had access to medical technology far beyond what the Coalition possessed, but he'd never expected to experience it firsthand. He relaxed back onto the cot and simply observed. Her hands continued their work, spreading the gel across the deep bruising on his ribs. He could actually feel the bones shifting slightly under her touch, realigning themselves to their proper positions. It should have hurt, God, it should have been excruciating, but whatever was in that gel provided complete anesthesia while simultaneously accelerating healing at rates that seemed like science fiction. "You fractured the 7th and 9th ribs," she said conversationally, her attention on her work. "The 8th had a stress fracture that would have become a full break within another day. Your left radius has 3 microfractures, your right knee has a partially torn meniscus, and you have 17 separate muscle groups with grade 2 strains. You also have a concussion, dehydration, borderline hypothermia, and approximately 60 individual cuts and abrasions of varying severity." Marcus processed that list with the detached interest of someone hearing about someone else's problems. "Sounds bad." "It is catastrophic," she agreed calmly. "A human medical facility would have you in intensive care for a minimum of 3 weeks, with another 2 months of physical therapy before you return to combat readiness. You would likely be medically discharged from your military with permanent disability status. But you did not walk 17 kilometers through a war zone to reach a Coalition medical facility, did you? You walked them to reach me." Her hands moved to his leg, where the torn meniscus was apparently next on the agenda. "And I am far more effective than any human doctor." The gel worked its magic on his knee, and Marcus watched in fascination as the swelling visibly decreased. "What is that stuff?" "Sanguine regenerative compound. It is derived from, well, the specifics would mean nothing to you. Sufficient to say that it encourages your body's natural healing processes to function at approximately 1000% normal efficiency. Your bones will be fully healed within 6 hours. Your soft tissue damage within 4. The concussion is already resolved." She moved on to his arms, treating each microfracture with the same careful attention she'd given the more serious injuries. "You should know," she continued, "that this compound is worth more than your annual military salary. In fact, the amount I am using on you right now could purchase a small spacecraft on the black market. I do not share it lightly." Marcus met her eyes. "Why share it at all? You could have just let me heal naturally. Or not heal at all." She paused in her work, considering the question. Because you earned it, Marcus Chin. Because you did something that I believed was impossible, and that deserves to be honored. Because. She trailed off, seeming uncertain, then shook her head and returned to her work. Because I choose to, she finished simply. They fell into comfortable silence as she worked. Marcus used the time to study her more closely now that they weren't actively trying to kill each other. Without the armor and the battlefield's chaos, he could see details he'd missed before. There were scars. Not many, but they were there, thin white lines that crossed her pale skin in patterns that suggested old wounds from bladed weapons. One particularly prominent scar ran from her left collarbone down between her breasts, disappearing beneath the bodysuit. Each scar was a story, a moment where something had managed to hurt her despite her phenomenal abilities. Her features, seen up close and calm, were arrestingly beautiful in that sharp, predatory way. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that were full and dark. Her nose had been broken at some point, he could see the slight deviation, and reset imperfectly. It made her look dangerous rather than conventionally beautiful, which somehow made her more attractive. And those eyes. Red as hot coals, but with depths to them that suggested vast intelligence and experience. She was 3 centuries old, she'd said. 300 years of war and killing and survival. What did the universe look like through eyes that old? You stare, she observed without looking up from treating a cut on his forearm. Can you blame me? No, she smiled slightly. Were I in your position, I would stare as well. It is natural to want to understand what has caught you. Caught me? Oh yes. She finished with his arms and sat back, regarding him with those ancient eyes. Make no mistake, little human, you are caught. The moment you walked into my challenge, the moment you survived our fight, the moment you dragged your broken body across 17 kilometers of hell to be here, you became mine. Perhaps not permanently. Perhaps not exclusively. But in this moment, in this place, you are mine. The way she said it sent a shiver down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with temperature. It should have been threatening. It should have made him want to flee. Instead, it felt like something clicking into place, like a key finding its lock. Yours? He repeated, testing the word. Mine. She stood in one fluid motion and began removing the bodysuit. Marcus's breath caught. She was completely unselfconscious about nudity, clearly viewing it as no more significant than removing a tool when it was no longer needed. The bodysuit peeled away to reveal the full glory of her form, powerful musculature wrapped in pale skin, curves that were more about function than aesthetics, a body built for war and violence and survival. Her breasts were modest, proportional to her frame, with dark nipples that hardened slightly in the cooler air of the station. Her stomach showed the definition of someone who trained constantly, and lower between her thighs. She smiled at his reaction. You have seen naked bodies before, surely? Your species is not typically so modest. Not like yours, Marcus managed. His body, even injured and exhausted, was responding in predictable ways. True. She moved to the cot and settled onto it beside him, the bedroll creaking under her weight. Now, we have several hours before your healing is complete and before we must return to the reality of war. I would like to use those hours productively. Her hand rested on his chest, over his heart, feeling its increased rhythm. You desired me, she said softly. Wanted me with an intensity that transcended survival instinct. You have proven yourself worthy of that desire. So now, Marcus Chin, you will receive what you have earned. But understand, this is not like mating with your own kind. I am stronger than you, faster than you, more durable in every measurable way. If I forget myself, if I lose control even for a moment, I could break you. Truly break you, in ways that even my medicines cannot repair. She leaned down until her lips were nearly brushing his ear. So you must tell me right now before we begin, do you trust me to know the limits of your fragile human body? Do you trust me to take you to the edge of those limits without pushing you over? Marcus turned his head to meet her gaze directly, and his voice was steady when he answered. I trusted you enough to come here. I trust you enough for this. Her smile was radiant and terrifying. Good answer. What followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his life. She was careful, meticulously so, constantly monitoring his responses and adjusting her strength. But even careful, even restrained, she was overwhelming. Her hands could have crushed bone but instead brought pleasure so intense it bordered on pain. Her mouth, with those slightly elongated canines that marked her species, traced patterns across his skin that left him gasping. Her body, pressed against his, was furnace-hot and powerful enough that he felt like a toy in her grip. She taught him the ways of her kind, the specific points on sanguinar physiology that brought pleasure so different from human anatomy. Showed him how to use his relative weakness as an advantage, how to make her strength work in his favor. Guided his hands to the places that made even a warrior of 3 centuries shudder with need. And when they finally came together, when she positioned herself above him with exquisite care and lowered herself onto him, Marcus understood why she'd warned him. The heat. God, the heat. She was burning from the inside, her metabolism so accelerated that he could feel it like a fever everywhere they touched. And the strength in her thighs as she moved, the power in her hips, the sheer overwhelming intensity of her, it was ecstasy and terror intertwined. She rode him with increasing abandon, her control slipping degree by degree as pleasure overwhelmed even her centuries of discipline. Her hands gripped his shoulders hard enough to bruise, and she had to consciously pull back several times when her strength threatened to cross the line from pain to injury. Marcus held on, literally held on to her hips as she moved, his fingers digging into that pale skin, and gave himself over to the experience. This was what he'd wanted, what he'd fought for, what he'd nearly died for. And it was worth it. God help him, it was worth everything. When she finally climaxed, her back arched and a sound tore from her throat that was half scream, half roar, and entirely primal. Her inner muscles contracted around him with force that should have been impossible, and Marcus followed her over the edge into white-hot oblivion. They collapsed together, her weight pressing him into the cot, their bodies slicked with sweat despite the station's cool air. For a long moment, neither of them moved, both simply breathing hard and processing what had just happened. Then she raised her head and looked down at him, and there was wonder in those ancient eyes. "You did not break," she whispered. "I pushed you to the absolute limits of human endurance and you did not break." Marcus grinned weakly. "Told you. Too mean to quit." She laughed and pressed her forehead to his, and in that moment they weren't enemies or even lovers. They were simply 2 beings who had found something unexpected in each other. They rested for a while, her body draped over his, the silence comfortable. Eventually she stirred and retrieved a canteen of water, actual water, not the chemical runoff he'd been drinking, and made him drink most of it. Then she checked his injuries again, satisfied that the healing compound was doing its work. "We have perhaps 4 more hours before the station becomes unsafe," she said, settling back onto the cot beside him. "Patrols will eventually sweep through here. The war does not pause for personal matters." 4 hours, Marcus repeated. "That's not much." "No. But it is what we have." She looked at him seriously. "You understand that when we leave here we are enemies again. The next time we meet on the battlefield I will be trying to kill you. And you will be trying to survive." "I know. This cannot be permanent, Marcus Chin. Our species are at war. Our causes are opposed. There is no happy ending to this story." "I know," he said again. Then after a pause, "But there's this. Right now. And maybe if we both survive long enough there might be other moments like this. Other neutral zones. Other nights." She considered that, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps. If we are very lucky and very careful, and if the universe is kinder than it has any obligation to be, then we'll make our own luck." He reached up and touched her face, tracing the line of her jaw. "We're both good at doing impossible things." She turned her head and kissed his palm. "Yes, we are." They made love twice more before the time ran out, each time learning more about each other's bodies, each time pushing boundaries and testing limits. By the 4th hour, Marcus's injuries were mostly healed, the regenerative compound having worked its near-miraculous effects. He felt stronger than he had in months, as though something in her medicine had optimized his body beyond its normal baseline. When the alarms they'd set indicated it was time to go, they dressed in silence. She returned to her armor, and he salvaged what he could of his combat gear. By the time they stepped out of the station into the harsh light of Kael'thara's twin suns, they had transformed back into what they'd been before. Soldier and Warbride, human and sanguinar, enemies divided by a war neither of them had started. She walked him to the edge of the neutral zone and there they paused. "Go back to your lines, Marcus Chin," she said formally. "Tell your commanders that you survived an encounter with me through skill and fortune. They will not believe the truth even if you told it. What will you tell yours? That I tested a human who showed promise, and found him worthy of life. She smiled slightly. They will accept that. My kind respect strength whatever its source. Marcus nodded. Then because he was who he was, he stepped forward and kissed her. She stiffened in surprise for just a moment, then relaxed into it, her hand coming up to cup the back of his head. The kiss was long and deep and tasted like farewell. When they broke apart, her eyes were glowing brighter than usual. Until next time, little human, she said softly. Until next time, he agreed. Then he turned and walked away, heading south toward the coalition lines, and didn't look back. Looking back would have made it harder, and he needed to stay focused on survival. Because now he had something to survive for beyond just spite and stubbornness. Now he had a reason to make it through the next battle, and the one after that, and all the battles to come. Now he had nights in neutral zones to look forward to. Behind him, the vampire Warbride watched until he disappeared from sight, then turned and made her own way back to the Dominion lines, her mind already planning their next encounter. The war continued, indifferent to the small miracle that had occurred in an abandoned terraforming station. Soldiers died. Territory changed hands. The great powers of the galaxy pursued their incomprehensible goals. But somewhere in the chaos, a human and a sanguiner had found something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. And in the end, perhaps that was its own kind of victory. The war on Kael'thara had finally ended, though ended was a generous term for what was really a strategic withdrawal by both sides. The planet had been so thoroughly devastated that it was no longer worth holding, and the fighting had shifted to other worlds, other systems. Marcus Chen, now a decorated sergeant with more confirmed kills than command knew what to do with, stood at the observation window of a coalition cruiser and watched the scarred world recede into the distance. His service contract was up in 6 months, and he was genuinely unsure whether he'd re-enlist. On the one hand, the military was all he'd known for years. On the other hand, there were rumors that the coalition and the Dominion were entering peace talks, that the war might actually end in something other than mutual annihilation. If there was peace, would there be neutral zones? Would there be? Sergeant Chin, you have a priority communication, the ship's AI announced. Source is encrypted and requesting private channel. Marcus's heart rate increased slightly. Patch it through to my quarters. 5 minutes later, he was staring at a hollow display showing a now familiar face, pale skin, white hair, burning red eyes, and a smile that promised both danger and delight. Hello, little human, she said. I hear your contract is almost finished. I hear there may be peace soon. I hear many interesting things. And I hear the Dominion is downsizing its military forces, Marcus replied, unable to keep the smile off his face. Lots of veterans looking for new purpose. Indeed. Purpose is so important, is it not? Her expression grew more serious. There are rumors of a colony ship. Independent, not affiliated with either coalition or Dominion. Seeking mixed-species crew for settlement in unclaimed space. They are particularly interested in security personnel with combat experience. Marcus's pulse quickened. That's so. Yes. I am told they would welcome both a human sergeant with impossible survival skills and a sanguiner warbride with 3 centuries of tactical experience. If such individuals were interested in a life that did not require them to be enemies. For a long moment, Marcus just looked at her. This impossible being who had become the center of his universe through a combination of violence, desire, and stubborn refusal to accept limitations. Send me the coordinates, he said finally. Her smile was radiant. Already done. I will see you there, Marcus Chin. And this time we will have more than a few hours in a neutral zone. We will have a lifetime to discover what is possible when we are not trying to kill each other. Looking forward to it, he said softly. As am I. Now go. Finish your contract. Survive your final battles. And then come find me, my beautiful, stubborn, impossible human. Come find me and we will build something new together. The connection closed, leaving Marcus staring at blank space where her face had been. He checked his personal data pad, found the coordinates she'd sent, and smiled. 6 months. He just had to survive 6 more months. He was Marcus Chin. He was too mean to quit. And he had the best possible reason to survive that any soldier had ever had. He was going to meet a vampire warbride at the edge of known space, and together they were going to do the impossible. Again.